was just in the yard, as I often am on a Monday evening, enjoying the cool night air of Fallbrook, California. Fallbrook is a beautiful place, known round the world for its avocados and other such farm fruit, vegetable products. So I was in my yard and I was picking up the remnants of the magnolia tree I had to cut up this past weekend. And magnolia has a particular smell. And the evening had a particular air. And as I was smelling that wood and I'm smelling the air, all of a sudden I have that scent of deep woods off. And it's like 1983. And I'm by Ottertail Lake. And the Olsons are there. Me and my buddy Eric are there. And the Whidvies are there. And Larry and Barb are there. And Bert and Darlene are there. And Stan and Linda are there. And I'm about 6 or 7 years old. And I remember the deep, heavy blanket of the summer humidity by the lake. And the smell of a campfire and hardwood burning, and the smell of deep woods off, mixing with that night air. And it's just pure summer. And I find myself too often in life in a space of what's next to do, what's next to do. Oh, I could do this. Oh, I have some time, I should do this. Oh, I could whittle away at this project. Oh, what about this? Oh, I got to follow up with that. Having children and learning to quiet my mind and learning to just slow down, learning to let go of to do, learning to let go of future, learning to let go of past. Just ironically, it's more unlearning than it's learning. And the more that I unlearn, the more a smell or a taste or just even the heaviness of the air will bring me back. It just brings you right back. And I realize all these memories and all these sensations and all these things are there. This beautiful, beautiful brain of ours, this beautiful body of ours is just capable of magnificent feats of memory that include sensations and smells and colors and just the essence of things. I remember capturing fireflies that night with Eric's cousin Heidi, who I had a crush on. What beautiful memories we carry with us, and what painful memories we carry with us. And how beautiful and important are those memories to the story of your life, to the story of my life, to connect the dots of my life, who I am, where I came from, how I became, what made you. What made you see the world the way you see it, the way you feel it, the way you experience it? Who hurt you? Who loved you? Who rescued you? Who challenged you? What helped you form What helped you form the framework from which you see the world, from which you interpret the present moment? We experience the present moment through all the memories. They're all accessible in the fabric of our being. And presumably our limbic brain, our brain, we don't even know that much. We think we know a little. But there's structures in the brain we like to call the limbic system, and they pick up on information automatically that has the potential to harm us. Just turns out being a human being is pretty fantastic. And so our limbic structure and our body, the memories stored in our body, the automatic pulses, it will pick up on threats, whether they're literal or in the mind or in the body. So the limbic brain observes the sensations of the body and says, threat. We feel uncomfortable in our body. Something must be wrong. What's wrong? And then our intellectual brain goes about trying to figure out what must be wrong. Well, it could be this or it could be that. Well, I should start telling a story about what could be wrong. It must be them. They did this. Oh, it was this. Oh, that person hurt me. So the limbic structure of our brain can access information from all these, electrochemical stories that we weave together neurologically in the fabric of our bodies and our brains. It can access that stuff in an instant. We're collecting data through the senses, through our external senses, eyes, ears, skin, nose, all that stuff. And we're collecting data from the internal world, from our own mind, from our own memories. We're collecting data from the sensations in our body, and we're designed to react automatically in the present moment to self-preserve, to be safe. Problem is we react to ideas and beliefs and memories and sensations in our body with the same response that we would to a lion stalking somewhere in the periphery, and we just feel it and we sense it and we know that something's wrong. And we feel that way when we feel a sensation of anxiety. We turn it into a story. We feel a certain pulse in our body when someone's around. I keep these little notes when I see clients during the day. And because of the COVID era, I've been seeing my clients from my home office, which is here. And I just jot down little things that are said sometimes, and I won't identify anyone. And this person that's behind this particular thing that comes to mind as I'm speaking, I know will be okay with sharing just one line. We've been trying to get to the bottom to gain insight into the sensations of fear and the sensations of anxiety in her body in the present moment that keep her from sleeping and keep her from really feeling free and happy in the present moment. Her body is telling her a story, and that story tells her to be careful. And that need to be careful takes over every other aspect of her life. Some things happened to her way back when. The people who were supposed to keep her safe weren't there for her. So what do? What story do you tell yourself in your body when the people that are supposed to keep you safe are not only not there for you, but they deny your reality when you try to tell it? And you're just a little girl. And all that you want is to be loved. All that you want is to be hugged. All that you want is to be told that you matter and that you're safe. That's all that you want. And some profoundly injured adult does something to you that no adult should ever do to a child. No other adult should ever allow it to happen. And you ask for help and no one's there. You ask for help and they tell you to be quiet. So you feel really unsafe and you feel really scared and you don't feel good. And your body starts telling a story, and that story starts to take on a life of its own. And in jogging the memory of those times, and I'll be thoughtful, but jogging the memory, I just wrote this down today. What comes to mind? Fear, stress, screaming, stomach drops when he comes in the door. My stomach drops when he comes in the door. The memories of an 8-year-old girl through a 29-year-old woman. So these memories are accessible to us anytime, any place, automatically, because of the beauty of this system. We calibrate our mind and body automatically through an interaction of genetics, biology, and experience. And we selectively attend to the world around us. And we start telling a story of our life. And there's villains, and there's angels, and there's gods, and there's demons, and there's successes, and there's failures, and there's I'm not good enough, and I'll never be, and someday I will. And the more that I've cleared my own space, the more that I've progressively taken responsibility for shit that I never thought I would take responsibility for, because I didn't even know it was there. I didn't know how deep in the shadow I would have to go to really take responsibility for what I create automatically from the places of fear within me, and the places of smallness within me, and the places of I'm not enough within me. And to learn progressively over the years, and then to, utilize the perception of suffering. And I say the perception because it's always in perception. It's so very, very real when you were in it. It was so very real for me. But now looking at it through the lens of observation and letting go, just to keep it simple, just looking back at it, you realize the perception of suffering. How close you were to freedom all the time. How close you were to realizing that the pulse in the body that says fear, that is then taken over by the web of the narrative of your life, is always just a breath away from being just dissipating like mist. And I don't mean to make it sound overly simple, but I have watched pretty hard dudes go from being very hard, very angry, very mean, very sad, very hurt, to recognizing it, to acknowledging it, to speaking it and telling the story of it and allowing it, and recognizing the sensation of it, and recognizing the ability to just feel it and observe it and sense it in the moment. To even notice that that story's like, man, just come on, let me tell it one more time. Let me do it one more time. Let's party. To just notice that and to be like, it's okay. I'm good. I just notice this feeling. I notice this sensation. I notice this thing. I honor that story. And I'm good. And I'm here. And I'm now. And I'm smelling the air. And I'm feeling the humidity on my skin. And I'm noticing the sensations of my body in the present moment. And when you really feel it and you really observe it, and you're able to let go of that story, when you're able to let go of the tangled web up there, it's beautiful. It's just a beautiful thing to notice the sensation of love, to notice the sensation of gratitude, to notice the sensation of peace, even to notice the sensation of anger, which in its purest form, without the injury, is just a masculine energy designed to protect you. We all have it. To feel the sensation, the desire to care for someone, to truly want to care for someone regardless of what you get in return. It's the highest service, and it feels natural. It feels good. So that's what led me in here tonight. And I think there's probably a couple tangents I went down that maybe I won't tie up, and that's okay. I'm going to try something a little different tonight, even though we're already 17 minutes in. I've had this book on my desk for a while now. It's called Tribe by Sebastian Junger. It's one of a bunch of books that really changed my perspective in life. Coincidentally, Sebastian Junger was co-producer, co-director, co-creator of a documentary film called Restrepo in the Karengal Valley of Afghanistan, who served at Outpost Restrepo, and it was a pretty rough place, and it was just a real desolate place on top of a mountain. And Sebastian Junger is a war correspondent. He was a journalist who was present in several different wars and skirmishes over 20-some years, and he's an excellent writer and storyteller and just a very direct, clear, honest speaker. And I became familiar with his work prior to ever realizing that he was a writer, because I coincidentally, see if I can bring it up here. This painting on the wall, I don't really talk about that much, but it was commissioned by a good friend of mine, who I won't name, who serves in the Army, and he's part of the selection process for our Special Operations Forces. And he was in the Karengal Valley when the stuff at Restrepo, for a long period of building Restrepo, he was part of building Restrepo, and he was there, and he really served this group of men that were at Outpost Restrepo. And I have a couple of journals from this friend of mine that he shared with me. And interestingly, he shared these journals in the past couple of years, but he commissioned the painting on the wall up here that's called The Long Walk Home. And he commissioned it after returning from Afghanistan way back then. I think it was 2009. He was there in 2007 to 2009, I think. I may be way off on that. Forgive me. But this painting was about, well, this painting was a big introduction for me to working with veterans, particularly with combat veterans. My brother's a Marine. I've always had military in my family, and I've, for a lot of different reasons, always been interested, fascinated, connected in some ways. But this painting taught me the most about the experiences of war as a civilian. So when he asked me to do this painting 12 years ago or whatever, I'm a civilian. I'm a early 30-something-year-old civilian that's doing a doctoral residency at the University of San Diego, and he comes back from Afghanistan and asks if I'll do this painting for him. And it, one of those things that kind of brings you to your knees and brings you to tears in a lot of ways, because it puts you face to face with your own inadequacy and your own fear and your own, yeah, but I don't know what that feels like. But I just kind of trusted what he was putting out there, and he was certainly trusting me. And so it turns out, I think that it became this representational piece of art, this process that was part of his journey of healing, kind of expressing that through me. And I realized that that's something I could do for people. And it's something that if I get out of my own way and someone tells their story, that I could express it through a piece of art, and that it might just be one of the most important things that they claim. And this painting was just purely many conversations with him, doing everything I could do as a civilian to just get a sense of, well, what is it like? What is it like to go to war and to come home? That's really what the painting was about. What is it like to go to war and come home? And my mind would get caught up in all these different ideas, all these different representational ideas, very much more kind of photorealistic type stuff that, storytelling. But after about 10 months or 9 months or so of being in my own life, and, I was doing a lot of therapy with people at that time. I was painting a lot in the San Diego community at that time. And I was really just in the thick of getting to know myself as a young man and as a young artist and as a young psychologist, and also just paying attention to what's going on overseas. And so this painting was an opportunity to face a lot of my own limitations and fears, and to get out of my way and allow someone else to speak through me, so to speak. And I believe there's one of these paintings at the SOCOM headquarters. I may get my acronyms mixed up. There was one at West Point. And there's a few hundred of them out there with all the graduates from my friend that works in the selection. Anyway, it's a very cool experience, and it's such a cool connection to this book, Tribe, by Sebastian Junger. And part of what Mr. Junger found was that by observing people in war and observing people in society and observing people in the civilian world, what he discovered was that people bond and people become close during times of struggle. Borders diminish within ourselves and around ourselves, and people come together and, become extremely, extremely close in war and in struggle. People, class goes away. People learn to depend on each other. They learn the meaning of neighbor. They learn the meaning of friend. They learn the meaning of family. They learn the meaning of love. It's why these guys that go to war together are so profoundly bonded to each other. Because they've been through the deepest, darkest, and most real of experiences, and they've experienced the deepest love at the same time. They've experienced the deepest pain at the same time, and the deepest fear, and the deepest hate, and the deepest regret, and the deepest honor. And that's really what that painting was about. I mean, that's what came out of it was, oh fuck, how do you feel everything all at once and just feel tangled up in yourself? Feel tangled up. So when I'm talking all flowery, you know, and in all these episodes I do about being in the moment, listening to my breath and noticing the sensations in my body, I don't discount in any way how tangled up some of you feel and how tangled up I've been. Oh, Lucy's at the door wanting to come in. We should probably let Lucy in. Come on, Lucy. Get your butt in here. Are you going to snore for everybody? Oh, Lucy is here. Okay. I wish I had the Lucy cam on, and Lucy's really old, so I'm not going to lift her up here because that'll hurt her. Probably hurt her old hips. But Lucy can sit right beside me. Lucy's gone deaf on me, and so she likes to bark to get attention. That may happen. Anyway, this book Tribe really opened up my eyes and opened up my perspective, and I wanted to read a little bit of it to you tonight. While Lucy is panting. Okay. And forgive me, folks. I'm going to check all my settings because I've been screwing it up lately. So this is Tribe, Chapter 1, The Men and the Dogs. Perhaps the single most startling fact about America is that, alone among the modern nations that have become world powers, it did so while butted up against 3,000 miles of howling wilderness populated by Stone Age tribes. From King Philip's War in the 1600s until the last Apache cattle raids across the Rio Grande in 1924, America waged an ongoing campaign against a native population that had barely changed technologically in 15,000 years. Over the course of 3 centuries, America became a booming industrial society that was cleaved by class divisions and racial injustice, but glued together by a body of law that, theoretically at least, saw all people as equal. The Indians, on the other hand, lived communally in mobile or semi-permanent encampments that were more or less run by consensus and broadly egalitarian. Oh, we lost Lucy. Lucy's in the night. Individual authority was earned rather than seized and imposed only on people who were willing to accept it. Anyone who didn't like it was free to move somewhere else. The proximity of these two cultures over the course of many generations presented both sides with a stark choice about how to live. By the end of the 19th century, factories were being built in Chicago and slums were taking root in New York, while Indians fought with spears and tomahawks 1,000 miles away. It may say something about human nature that a surprising number of Americans, mostly men, wound up joining Indian society rather than staying in their own. They emulated Indians, married them, were adopted by them, and on some occasions even fought alongside them. And the opposite almost never happened. Indians almost never ran away to join white society. Emigration always seemed to go from the civilized to the tribal, and it left Western thinkers flummoxed about how to explain such an apparent rejection of their society. When an Indian child has been brought up among us, taught our language, this is in parentheses, when an Indian, or in quotation marks rather, When an Indian child has been brought up among us, taught our language, and habituated to our customs, Benjamin Franklin wrote to a friend in 1753, yet if he goes to see his relations and make one Indian ramble with them, there is no persuading him ever to return. On the other hand, Franklin continued, white captives who were liberated from the Indians were almost impossible to keep at home. Though ransomed by their friends and treated with all imaginable tenderness to prevail with them to stay among the English, yet in a short time they become disgusted with our manner of life, and take the first good opportunity of escaping into the woods. The preference for tribal life among many whites was a problem that played out in particularly wrenching ways during the Pennsylvania frontier wars of the 1760s. In the spring of 1763, an Ottawa Indian leader named Pontiac convened a council of tribes along a small river named the Isorces, near the former French trading post at Detroit, in what is now the state of Michigan. The steady advance of white settlements was a threat that unified the Indian tribes in ways that no amount of peace and prosperity ever could, and Pontiac thought that with a broad enough alliance he might push the whites back to where they had been a generation or two earlier. Among the Indians were hundreds of white settlers who had been captured from frontier communities and adopted into the tribes. Some were content with their new families and some were not, but collectively they were of enormous political concern to the colonial authorities. The meeting of the tribes was coordinated by runners who could cover 100 miles in a day and who delivered gifts of shell wampum belts and tobacco along with the message of urgent assembly. The belts were beaded in such a way that even distant tribes would understand that the meeting was set for the 15th day of Iskigamizij Gizis, forgive me for that, the sap-boiling moon. Groups of Indians drifted into Revere Esorces and encamped along the banks of the river until finally, on the morning of what English settlers knew as April 27th, old men began passing through the camp, calling the warriors to council. They issued from their cabins, the tall, naked figures of the wild Ojibwas, with quivers slung at their backs and light war clubs resting in the hollow of their arms. Historian Francis Parkman wrote a century later, Ottawas wrapped close in their gaudy blankets, Wyandots fluttering in painted shirts, their heads adorned with feathers and their leggings garnished with bells. All were soon seated within a wide circle upon the grass, row within row, a grave and silent assembly. Pontiac was known for his high oratory, and by the end of the day he'd convinced the assembled warriors that the future of their people was at stake. 300 warriors marched on the English fort, with 2,000 more fighters waiting in the woods for the signal to attack. After initially trying to take the fort by stealth, they withdrew and attacked, naked and screaming, with bullets in their mouths for easy reloading. The attempt failed, but soon afterward the entire frontier erupted in war. Virtually every outfort and stockade from the upper Allegheny to the Blue Ridge was assaulted simultaneously. Le Boeuf, Venango, Presque Isle, La Baye, St. Joseph, Miamis, Uchtanen, Sandusky, and Michilimackinac were overrun and their defenders massacred. Scalping parties fanned out through the woodlands and descended upon remote farms and settlements up and down the eastern escarpment, killing an estimated 2,000 settlers. Survivors fled eastward into the Pennsylvania frontier, basically started at Lancaster and Carlisle. The English response was slow but unstoppable. The remnants of the 42nd and 77th Highlander Infantry, recently returned from military action in Cuba, were mustered at the military barracks in Carlisle and prepared for the 200-mile march to Fort Pitt. They were joined by 700 local militia and 30 backwoods scouts and hunters. The Highlanders were supposed to protect the column's flanks, but were taken off the job almost immediately because they kept getting lost in the woods. The commander was a young Swiss colonel named Henry Bouquet, who had seen combat in Europe and joined the English to advance his career. His orders were simple: march across Pennsylvania march across Pennsylvania with axemen clearing the way for his wagons and reinforce Fort Pitt, other beleaguered garrisons on the frontier. No prisoners were taken. Native women and children were to be captured and sold into slavery. Maybe I should say that again. Native women and children were to be captured and sold into slavery. And bounties were to be paid for any scalp, male or female, that white settlers managed to carve from an Indian head. Bouquet's army lumbered out of Carlisle in July 1763 and within months had defeated the Indians at Bushy Run and reinforced Fort Pitt and several outlying garrisons. The following summer, they carried their campaign into the heart of Indian Territory, sometimes covering 5 miles, sometimes covering 10. Bouquet's army ground its way through the rich, flat country of the Ohio River basin. They passed through great stands of hardwood and open savannas fed by innumerable green creeks and rivers. Some of the rivers had gravel beaches running for miles that afforded clear passage for the column's supply wagons. The timber was mostly free of underbrush and could be passed easily by men on foot or on horseback. It was a kind of paradise that they were traveling through, and Bouquet's journals mentioned the natural beauty of the land on almost every page. By mid-October, Bouquet had gained Muskingum River, deep in Shawnee and Delaware territory, and an Indian delegation met with him to sue for peace. Hoping to intimidate them, Bouquet deployed his forces across an adjacent meadow. Rank upon rank of men-at-arms, with their bayonets fixed, kilted Highlanders arrayed behind their regimental flags, and dozens of backwoodsmen dressed much like the Indians and leaning confidently on their rifles in a way that must have been enormously reassuring to a European colonel in the wilderness. First and foremost, Bouquet demanded the immediate return of all white prisoners, and any delay would be considered a declaration of war. During the next few weeks, around 200 captives were brought in, more than half of them women and children, and many too young to remember having lived otherwise. Some had forgotten their Christian names and were recorded in the ledgers with descriptions such as Red Jacket, Big Head, Sore Mouth, and Sour Plums. Dozens of white relatives of the missing had accompanied Bouquet's forces from Fort Pitt, and in addition to the many joyful reunions, there were also wrenching scenes of grief and confusion. Young women married to Indian men now standing reluctantly before their former families, children screaming as they were pulled from their Indian kin and delivered to people they didn't recognize and probably considered enemies. The Indians seemed universally anguished to give up their family members, and when Bouquet's army finally decamped for Fort Pitt in early November, many trailed behind the column, hunting game for their loved ones and trying to delay the final goodbye as long as possible. One Mingo brave refused to leave the side of a young Virginia woman, despite warnings that her former family would kill him on sight. It must not be denied that there were even some grown persons who shewed an unwillingness to return, William Smith, a contemporary of Bouquet's, admitted about some of the white captives. The Shawanese were obliged to bind several of their prisoners, and some women, who had been delivered up, afterward found means to escape and run back to the Indian towns. The reluctance of Bouquet's captives to leave their adopted tribe raised awkward questions about the supposed superiority of Western society. It was understood why young children would not want to return to their original families, and it made sense that renegades like the infamous Simon Girty would later seek refuge with the Indians and even fight alongside them. But as Benjamin Franklin pointed out, there were numerous settlers who were captured as adults and still seemed to prefer Indian society to their own. And what about people who voluntarily joined the Indians? What about men who walked off into the tree line and never came home? The frontier was full of men who joined the Indian tribes, married Indian women, and lived their lives completely outside civilization. Thousands of Europeans are Indians, and we have no examples of even one of those aborigines having, from choice, become European. A French emigre named Hector de Crevoisier, I just made that up, lamented in 1782, there must be in their social bond something singularly captivating and far superior to anything to be boasted of among us. Crevoisier seemed to have understood that the intensely communal nature of an Indian tribe held an appeal that material benefits of Western civilization couldn't necessarily compete with. If he was right, the problem started almost as soon as Europeans touched across American shores. As early as 1612, Spanish authorities noted in amazement that 40 or 50 Virginians had married into Indian tribes and that even English women were openly mingling with the natives. At that point, whites had been in Virginia for only a few years, and many who joined the Indians would have been born and raised in England. These were not rough frontiersmen who were sneaking off to join the savages. These were the sons and daughters of Europe. Notwithstanding, the Indian women have all the fuel and bread to procure and the cooking to perform. Their task is probably not harder than that of white women. Sorry about that. Notwithstanding, the Indian women who have all the fuel and bread to procure and the cooking to perform, their task is probably not harder than that of the white women, wrote a Seneca captive named Mary Jemison at the end of her long life. Jemison, who was taken from her family's farm on the Pennsylvania frontier at age 15, became so enamored of Seneca that life that she once hid from a white search party that had come looking for her. We had no master to oversee or drive us, so that we could work as leisurely as we pleased, she explained. No people can live more happy than the Indians did in times of peace. Their lives were a continual round of pleasures. In an attempt to stem the flow of young people into the woods, Virginia and other colonies imposed severe penalties on anyone who would take up with the Indians. The Puritan leaders of New England found it particularly galling that anyone would turn their back on Christian society. People are ready to run wild into the woods again and to be as heathenish as ever if you do not prevent it, an early Puritan named Increase Mather complained in a tract called Discourse Concerning the Danger of Apostasy. Mather was an early administrator of Harvard who spent his life combating and criminalizing any relaxation of the Puritan moral code. It was a futile battle. The nature of the frontier was that it kept expanding beyond the reach of church and state, and out on the fringes, people tended to do what they wanted. The Indian manner was clearly suited to the wilderness, and it wasn't long before frontiersmen began to shed their European clothing and openly emulate people they often referred to as savages. They dressed in buckskin and open-backed leggings and had muslin breechclouts strapped between their legs. Some even attended Sunday service that way, which so distracted the girls at one church that their minister accused them of not listening to his sermons. The men smoked tobacco and carried tomahawks in their belts and picked up Indian languages and customs. They learned to track and stalk game and move quickly and quietly in the woods, and they adopted what the Puritans dismissed as a skulking way of war. They fought from concealment as individuals, in other words, rather than lining up like tin soldiers. The men and the dogs have a fine time, but the poor women have to suffer, one pioneer wife wrote to her sister about life on the frontier. She complained that her husband, a man named George, refused to make their newborn son a plank cradle and just gave her a hollowed-out log instead. The boy's only shirt was woven of nettle bark and his pillow was carved out of wood. When his mother pointed out that he was getting sores and rashes, George said that the hardships would just toughen him up for hunting later in life. George has gotten himself a buckskin shirt and pants, this woman added. He has gone hunting day and night. It's easier for people in modern society to romanticize Indian life, and it might well have been easy for men like George as well. That impulse should be guarded against. Virtually all of the Indian tribes waged war against their neighbors and practiced deeply sickening forms of torture. Prisoners who weren't tomahawked on the spot could expect to be disemboweled and tied to a tree where their own intestines or blistered to death over a slow fire, or simply hacked to pieces and fed alive to the dogs. If there is any conceivable defense for such cruelty, it might be that in Europe at the time, the Spanish Inquisition was also busy serving up just as much barbarism on behalf of the Catholic Church. Infidels were regularly burned alive, broken on the rack, sawn in half lengthwise, or impaled slowly on wooden stakes from the anus to the mouth. The Protestant Reformation changed a lot of things about Christianity, but not its capacity for cruelty. And early Puritan leaders in New England were also renowned for their harsh justice. Cruelty... Wow, that was a loud fireworks right there. I hope that's what it was. Cruelty, in other words, was very much the norm for that era, and the native tribes of North America were no exception. On other levels, however, there seemed to be no competing with the appeal of the Indians. Forgive me, that was a very loud boom, and I don't think it was a firework. On other levels, however, there seemed to be no competing with the appeal of the Indians. Hunting was obviously more varied and interesting than plowing fields. Sexual mores were more relaxed than in the early colonies. In the 1600s, colonial boys on Cape Cod were publicly whipped if they were caught talking to a girl they weren't related to. Indian clothing was more comfortable. Indian religion was less harsh, and Indian society was essentially classless and egalitarian. As the frontier marched across North America from the Alleghenies to the Great Plains to the Rockies and then finally to the West Coast, successive generations of pioneers were subject to being captured and adopted into Indian tribes, or simply ran off to join them. For all the temptations of native life, one of the most compelling might have been its fundamental egalitarianism. Personal property was usually limited to whatever could be transported by horse or on foot, so gross inequalities of wealth were difficult to accumulate. Successful hunters and warriors could support multiple wives, but unlike modern society, those advantages were generally not passed on through the generations. Social status came through hunting and war, which all men had access to, and women had far more autonomy and sexual freedom and bore fewer children than women in white society. Here I have no master, an anonymous colonial woman was quoted by the secretary of the French legation as saying about her life with the Indians. I am the equal of all the women in the tribe. I do what I please without anyone saying anything about it. I work only for myself. I shall marry if I wish and be unmarried again when I wish. Is there a single woman as independent as I in your cities? Because of these top basic freedoms, tribal members tended to be exceedingly loyal. A white captive of the Kickapoo Nation, who came to be known as John Dunn Hunter, wrote that he had never heard of even a single instance of treason against the tribe, and as a result, punishments for such transgressions simply didn't exist. But cowardice was punished by death, as was murder within the tribe or any kind of communication with the enemy. It was a simple ethos that promoted loyalty and courage over all other virtues and considered the preservation of the tribe an almost sacred task, which indeed it was. The question for Western society isn't so much why tribal life might be so appealing. It seems obvious on the face of it, but why Western society is so unappealing. On a material level, it is clearly more comfortable and protected from the hardships of the natural world. But as societies become more affluent, they tend to require more, rather than less, time and commitment by the individual, and it's possible that many people feel that affluence and safety simply aren't a good trade for freedom. One study in the 1960s found that nomadic Kung people of the Kalahari Desert needed to work as little as 12 hours a week in order to survive, roughly 1/4 the hours of the average urban executive at the time. The camp is an open aggregate of cooperating persons which changes in size and composition from day to day. Anthropologist Richard Lee noted with clear admiration in 1968, the members move out each day to hunt and gather and return in the evening to pool the collected foods in such a way that every person present receives an equitable share. Because of the strong emphasis on sharing and the frequency of movement, surplus accumulation is kept to a minimum. The Kalahari is one of the harshest environments in the world, and the Ikung were able to continue living a Stone Age existence well into the 1970s, precisely because no one else wanted to live there. The Ikung were so well adapted to their environment that during the times of drought, nearby farmers and cattle herders abandoned their livelihoods to join them in the bush because foraging and hunting were a more reliable source of food. The relatively relaxed pace of the Ikung life, even during times of adversity, challenged long-standing ideas that modern society created a surplus of leisure time. It created exactly the opposite, a desperate cycle of work, financial obligation, and more work. The Ikung had far fewer belongings than Westerners, but their lives were under much greater personal control. Among anthropologists, the Ikung are thought to present a fairly accurate picture of how our hominid ancestors lived for more than 1 million years before the advent of agriculture. Genetic adaptations take around 25,000 years to appear in humans, so the enormous changes that came with agriculture in the last 10,000 years have hardly begun to affect our gene pool. Early humans would most likely have lived in nomadic bands of around 50 people, much like the Ikung. I might be saying this wrong because it's spelled kind of funny. They would have experienced high levels of accidental injuries and death. They would have counted domineering behavior by senior males by forming coalitions within the group. They would have countered domineering behavior by senior males by forming coalitions within the group. They would have been utterly intolerant of hoarding or selfishness. They would have occasionally endured episodes of hunger, violence, and hardship. They would have practiced extremely close and involved childcare, and they would have done almost everything in the company of others. They would have almost never been alone. First, agriculture and then industry changed two fundamental things about the human experience. The accumulation of personal property allowed people to make more and more individualistic choices about their lives, and those choices unavoidably diminished group efforts toward a common good. And as society modernized, people found themselves able to live independently from any communal group. A person living in a modern city or a suburb can, for the first time in history, go through an entire day or an entire life mostly encountering complete strangers. They can be surrounded by others and yet feel deeply, dangerously alone. The evidence that this is hard on us is overwhelming. Although happiness is notoriously subjective and difficult to measure, mental illness is not. Numerous cross-cultural studies have shown that modern society, despite its nearly miraculous advances in medicine, science, and technology, is afflicted with some of the highest rates of depression, schizophrenia, poor health, anxiety, and chronic loneliness in human history. As affluence and urbanization rise in a society, rates of depression and suicide tend to go up rather than down. Rather than buffering people from clinical depression, increased wealth in a society seems to foster it. Suicide is difficult to study among unacculturated tribal peoples because the early explorers who first encountered them rarely conducted rigorous ethnographic research. There's remarkably little evidence of depression-based suicide in tribal societies. Among the American Indians, for example, suicide was understood to apply in very narrow circumstances. In old age to avoid burdening the tribe, in the ritual paroxysms of grief following the death of a spouse, in a hopeless but heroic battle with an enemy, and in an attempt to avoid the agony of torture. Among tribes that were ravaged by smallpox, it was almost understood that a person whose face had been hideously disfigured by lesions might kill themselves. According to the ethics of suicide, historical sources, early chroniclers of the American Indians couldn't find any examples of suicide that were rooted in psychological causes. Early sources report that the Bella Coola, the Ojibwa, the Montagnais, the Arapaho, the Plateau Yuma, the Southern Paiute, and the Zuni, among many others, experience no suicide at all. This stands in stark contrast to many modern societies where the suicide rate is as high as 25 cases per 100,000. In the United States, white middle-aged men currently have the highest rate at nearly 30 suicides per 100,000. According to a global survey by the World Health Organization, people in wealthy countries suffer depression at as much as 8 times the rate they do in poor countries. And people in countries with large income disparities, like the United States, run a much higher lifelong risk of developing severe mood disorders. A 2006 study comparing depression rates in Nigeria to depression rates in North America found that across the board, women in rural areas were less likely to get depressed from their urban counterparts. And urban North American women, the most affluent demographic of the study, were the most likely to experience depression. The mechanism seems simple. Poor people are forced to share their time and resources more than wealthy people are, and as a result, they live in closer communities. Interreliant poverty comes with its own stresses and certainly isn't the American ideal, but it's much closer to our evolutionary heritage than affluence. A wealthy person who has never had to rely on help and resources from his community is leading a privileged life that falls way outside more than 1 million years of human experience. Financial independence can lead to isolation, and isolation can put people at a greatly increased risk of depression and suicide. This might be a fair trade for a generally wealthier society, but a trade it is. The psychological effect of placing such importance on affluence can be seen in microcosm in the legal profession. In 2015, the George Washington Law Review surveyed more than 6,000 lawyers and found that conventional success in the legal profession, such as high billable hours or making partner at a law firm, had zero correlation with the level of happiness and well-being reported by the lawyers themselves. In fact, public defenders who have far lower status than corporate lawyers seem to lead significantly happier lives. The findings are in keeping with something called self-determination theory, which holds that human beings need 3 basic things in order to be content. They need to feel competent at what they do, they need to feel authentic in their lives, and they need to feel connected to others. These values are considered intrinsic to human happiness and far outweigh extrinsic values such as beauty, money, and status. I'll say that again. 3 basic things in order to be content. They need to feel competent at what they do. They need to feel authentic in their lives, and they need to feel connected to others. These values are considered intrinsic to human happiness and far outweigh extrinsic values such as beauty, money, and status. Bluntly put, modern society seems to emphasize extrinsic values over intrinsic ones, and as a result, mental health issues refuse to decline with growing wealth. The more assimilated a person is into American society, the more likely they are to develop depression during the course of their lifetime, regardless of what ethnicity they are. Mexicans born in the United States are wealthier than Mexicans born in Mexico, but far more likely to suffer from depression. Like corporate lawyers, they may have a harder time achieving the 3 pillars of self-determination, autonomy, competence, and community, and wind up with a higher rate of depression. By contrast, Amish society has an exceedingly low rate of depression because, it is theorized, many Amish remain utterly unassimilated into modern society to the extent that they won't even drive cars. Okay, forgive me here because my daughters ripped these pages out and now I have to try to put them together. The economic and marketing forces of modern society have engineered an environment that maximizes consumption at the long-term cost of well-being. A study in the Journal of Affective Disorders concluded in 2012, in effect, humans have dragged a body within a long hominid history into an overfed, malnourished, sedentary, sunlit deficient, sleep-deprived, competitive, inequitable, and socially isolating environment with dire consequences. The alienating effects of wealth and modernity modernity on the human experience start virtually at birth and never let up. Infants in hunter-gatherer societies are carried by their mothers as much as 90% of the time, which roughly corresponds to carrying rates of other primates. One can get an idea of how important this kind of touch is to primates from an infamous experiment conducted in the 1950s by a primatologist and psychologist named Harry Harlow. Baby rhesus monkeys were separated from their mothers and presented with a choice of two kinds of surrogates, a cuddly mother made out of terry cloth or an uninviting mother made out of a wire mesh. The wire mesh mother, however, had a nipple that dispensed warm milk. The babies took their nourishment as quickly as possible and then rushed back to cling to the terry cloth mother, which had enough softness to provide the illusion of affection. Clearly, touch and closeness are vital to the health of baby primates, including humans. In America during the 1970s, mothers maintained skin-to-skin contact with babies as little as 16% of the time, which is a level that traditional societies would probably consider a form of child abuse. Also unthinkable would be the modern practice of making young children sleep by themselves. In two American studies of middle-class families during the 1980s, 85% of young children slept alone in their own room, a figure that rose to 95% among families considered well-educated. Northern European societies, including America, are the only ones in history to make very young children sleep alone in such numbers. The isolation is thought to make many children bond intensely with stuffed animals for reassurance. Only in Northern European societies do children go through the well-known developmental stage of bonding with stuffed animals. Elsewhere, children get their sense of safety from the adults sleeping near them. The point of making children sleep alone, according to Western psychologists, is to make them self-soothing. I've actually had this argument with other psychologists. But that clearly runs contrary to our evolution. Humans are primates. We share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, and primates almost never leave infants unattended because they would be extremely vulnerable to predators. Infants seem to know this instinctively, so being left alone in a dark room is terrifying to them. Compare the self-soothing approach to that of a traditional Mayan community in Guatemala. Infants and children simply fall asleep when sleepy, do not wear specific clothes or use traditional transitional objects, room share and co-sleep with parents or siblings, and nurse on demand during the night. Another study notes about Bali, babies are encouraged to acquire quickly the capacity to sleep under any circumstances, including situations of high stimulation, musical performances, and other noisy observances, which reflect their more complete integration into adult social activities. As modern society reduced the role of the community, it simultaneously elevated the role of authority. The two are uneasy companions, and as one goes up, the other tends to go down. In 2007, anthropologist Christopher Boehm published an analysis of 154 foraging societies that were deemed to be representative of our ancestral past. And one of their most common traits was the absence of major wealth disparities between individuals. Another was the absence of arbitrary authority. Social life is politically egalitarian in that there is always a low tolerance by a group's mature males for one of their number dominating, bossing, or denigrating the others, Boehm observed. The human conscious evolved in the middle to late Pleistocene as a result of the hunting of large game. This required cooperative band-level sharing of meat. Because tribal foragers are highly mobile and can easily shift between different communities, authority is almost impossible to impose on the unwilling. And even without that option, males who try to take control of the group or of the food supply are often countered by coalitions of other males. This is clearly an ancient and adaptive behavior that tends to keep groups together and equitably cared for. In his survey of ancestral-type societies, Boehm found that in addition to murder and theft, One of the most commonly punished infractions was failure to share. Freeloading on the hard work of others and bullying were also high up on the list. Punishments included public ridicule, shunning, and finally, assassination of the culprit by the entire group. A cave painting from the early Holocene in Spain showed 10 figures with bows in their hands and a lone figure prone on the ground with what appeared to be 10 arrows sticking out of him. The configuration strongly suggests an execution rather than death in combat. Boehm points out that among current-day foraging groups, group execution is one of the most common ways of punishing males who try to claim a disproportionate amount of the group's resources. Boehm's research has led him to believe that much of the evolutionary basis for moral behavior stems from group pressure. Not only are bad actions punished, but good actions are rewarded. When a person does something for another person, a pro-social act, as it's called, they are rewarded not only by a group approval, but also by an increase of dopamine and other pleasurable hormones in their blood. Group cooperation triggers higher levels of oxytocin, for example, which promotes everything from breastfeeding in women to higher levels of trust and group bonding in men. Both reactions impart a powerful sensation of well-being. Oxytocin creates a feedback loop of good feeling and group loyalty that ultimately leads members to self-sacrifice to promote group welfare. In the words of one study, hominids that cooperated with one another and punished those who didn't must have outfought, outhunted, and outbred everyone else. These are the hominids that modern humans are descended from. It's revealing, then, to look at modern society through the prism of more than 1 million years of human cooperation and resource sharing. Just hear that for a second. 1 million years of human cooperation and resource sharing. That's insane to just fathom 1 million years of human experience. Subsistence level hunters aren't necessarily more moral than other people. They just can't get away with selfish behavior because they live in small groups where almost everything is open to scrutiny. Modern society, on the other hand, is a sprawling and anonymous mess where people can get away with incredible levels of dishonesty without getting caught. What tribal people would consider a profound betrayal of the group, modern society simply dismisses as fraud. Around 3% of people on unemployment assistance intentionally cheat the system, for example, which costs the United States more than $2 billion a year. Such abuse would be immediately punished in tribal society. Fraud in welfare and other entitlement programs is estimated to be at roughly the same rate, which adds another $1.5 billion in annual losses. That figure, however, is eclipsed by Medicare and Medicaid fraud, which is conservatively estimated at 10% of total payments, or around $100 billion a year. Some estimates run to 2 or 3 times that figure. Fraud in the insurance industry is calculated to be $100 billion to $300 billion a year, a cost that gets passed directly to consumers in the form of higher premiums. All told, combined public and private sector fraud costs every household in the United States probably around $5,000 a year, or roughly the equivalent of working 4 months at a minimum wage job. A hunter-gatherer community that lost 4 months' worth of food would face a serious threat to its survival, and its retribution against the people who caused that hardship would be immediate and probably very violent. Westerners live in a complex society, and opportunities for scamming relatively small amounts of money off the bottom are almost endless and very hard to catch. But scamming large amounts of money off the top seems even harder to catch. Fraud by American defense contractors is estimated at around $100 billion per year, and they are relatively well behaved compared to that of the financial industry. The FBI reports that since the economic recession of 2008, securities and commodities fraud in the United States has gone up by more than 50%. In the decade prior, almost 90% of corporate fraud cases, insider trading, kickbacks and bribes, false accounting, implicated the company's chief executive officer and or chief financial officer. The recession, which was triggered by illegal and unwise banking practices, cost American shareholders several $trillion in stock value losses and is thought to have set the American economy back by a decade and a half. Total costs for the recession have been estimated to be as high as $14 trillion, or about $45,000 per citizen. Most tribal and subsistence-level societies would inflict severe punishments on anyone who caused that kind of damage. Cowardice is another form of community betrayal, and most Indian tribes punished it with immediate death. If that seems harsh, consider that the British military took cowards off the battlefield and executed them by firing squad as late as World War I. It can be assumed that hunter-gatherers would treat their version of a welfare cheat or a dishonest banker as decisively as they would a coward. They may not kill him, but he would certainly be banished from the community. The fact that a group of people can cost American society several $1 trillion in losses, roughly 1/4 of that year's gross domestic product, and not be tried for high crimes shows how completely detribalized the country has become. Dishonest bankers and welfare or insurance cheats are the modern equivalent of tribe members who quietly steal more than their fair share of meat or other resources. This is very different from alpha males who bully others and openly steal resources. Among hunter-gatherers, bullying males are often faced down by coalitions of other senior males, but that rarely happens in modern society. For years, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission has been trying to force senior corporate executives to disclose the ratio of their pay to that of their median employees. During the 1960s, senior executives in America typically made around $20 for every dollar earned by a rank-and-file worker. Since then, that figure has climbed to 300 to 1 among S&P 500 companies, and in some cases it goes far higher than that. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce managed to block all attempts to force disclosure of corporate pay ratios until 2015, when a weakened version of the rule was finally passed by the SEC in a strict party line vote of 3 Democrats in favor and 2 Republicans opposed. In hunter-gatherer terms, these senior executives are claiming a disproportionate amount of food simply because they have the power to do so. A tribe like the Ikung would not permit that because it would represent a serious threat to group cohesion and survival, but that is not true for a wealthy country like the United States. There have been occasional demonstrations against economic disparity, like the Occupy Wall Street protest camp of 2011, but they were generally peaceful and ineffective. The riots and demonstrations against racial discrimination that later took place in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland, led to changes in part because they attained a level of violence that threatened the civil order. A deep and enduring economic crisis like the Great Depression of the 1930s or a natural disaster that kills tens of thousands of people might change America's fundamental calculus about economic justice. Until then, the American public will probably continue to refrain from broadly challenging both male and female corporate leaders who compensate themselves far in excess of their value to society. This is ironic because the political origins of the United States lay in confronting precisely this kind of resource seizure by people in power. King George III of England caused the English colonies in America to rebel by trying to tax them without allowing them a voice in government. In this sense, democratic revolutions are just a formalized version of the sort of group action that coalitions of senior males have used throughout the ages to confront greed and abuse. In this sense, democratic revolutions are just a formalized version of the sort of group action that coalitions of senior males have used throughout the ages to confront greed and abuse. Thomas Paine, one of the principal architects of American democracy, wrote a formal denunciation of civilization in a tract called Agrarian Justice. Whether civilization has most promoted or most injured the general happiness of man is a question that may be strongly contested, he wrote in 1795. Both the most affluent and the most miserable of the human race are to be found in the countries that are called civilized. When Paine wrote this tract, Shawnee and Delaware warriors were still attacking settlements just a few hundred miles from downtown Philadelphia. They held scores of white captives, many of whom had been adopted into the tribe and had no desire to return to colonial society. There is no way to know the effect on Paine's thought process of living next door to a communal Stone Age society, but it might have been crucial. Paine acknowledged that these tribes lacked the advantages of the arts and science and manufacturing, and yet they lived in a society where personal poverty was unknown and the natural rights of man were actively promoted. In that sense, Paine claimed the American Indian should serve as a model for how to eradicate poverty and bring natural rights back into civilized life. Thus endeth Chapter 1 of Tribe by Sebastian Junger. If you're still listening, thank you for being here tonight. What would it be like for people with integrity and strength of heart and honesty of mind to come together and work to eradicate, work to push out of the tribe those who would knowingly take advantage of their power and directly harm the tribe? This is Dr. Mark Jesinoski. This is the Wizard Podcast, episode 27. Good night.